Hello there. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Marche, the webinar director at Advice Chaser. Before we introduce our guest and get started, I do need to do a little bit of legal housekeeping. Advice Chaser, the host of this webinar, is not a registered investment advisor. We cannot and do not give financial advice. Today's presentation is for educational purposes only and could not be considered advice for any person's individual situation. Advice Chaser regularly hosts informative webinars, such as this one, featuring a variety of knowledgeable professionals, many of whom are licensed advisors. Any opinions, ideas, jokes, or principles expressed by presenters are their own, and however true, funny, or interesting, are not endorsed by Advice Chaser. Please do not act on the information you hear today without consulting a qualified financial professional. And Annalee, you can go ahead and move to the next slide so we can show our folks what this webinar is about. We're thrilled to bring you this educational presentation about moving your aging parent to a care facility. Attendees are muted, but we do encourage you to ask questions using the chat box, and the presenter will answer those queries during the question and answer section of the webinar today as appropriate. If you ask a question in the chat box, go ahead and leave your phone number as well. And if we can't get to your question during the event, we'll make sure someone reaches out to you after today's event. Again, we want this experience to be as educational as possible, so please don't hesitate to ask for clarification or expansion of the material. And Annalee, I'd love to show them your bio slides if you can move to the next one. There we go. Today's presenter is Lee Kruger. She is the founder and president of CareGiver, Inc., the concierge of senior care planning. CareGiver assists families in navigating the complexities associated with the aging process by managing crisis situations, developing a proactive aging plan, facilitating family meetings, and providing needed support to struggling caregivers. For Lee, providing proactive senior care planning to families is more than just a career, it's her passion. Lee has spent her entire career in the senior care industry and has become a nationally recognized expert in the field of senior care planning. Lee is the author of The Invisible Patient, which outlines the emotional, physical, and financial toll experienced by family caregivers. Also, Lee is the founder of Care Crusade, a national campaign for family members with loved ones in healthcare facilities to improve the quality of care. Lee, we're glad to have you back, and I'm just going to go ahead and turn over the time to you.
Very good. Thank you, Marche, and thank you everybody for joining us today. My name is Lee Kruger with CareGiver Incorporated. Today, we're going to talk about moving your aging parent to a care facility. One of the reasons I actually started my company, CareGiver Incorporated, in 2011 is because at the time I was a social worker and admissions person for long-term care, Ccrcs, or continuing care retirement communities. And every day I had families in my office because there was a medical crisis with mom or dad or both. And mom was in the hospital or dad was in the hospital. And the hospital discharge planner tells the kids, here's a list of facilities, go find one by noon tomorrow because we're discharging. And that never makes anyone feel comfortable, right? So the kids or the healthy spouse and the kids are literally dropping what they're doing to come in and tour all of these different facilities. The tour would only take about an hour, but I was spending 2 and 3 and sometimes 4 hours at a time with each family because they had so many questions about what to look for, what to ask about. There were family dynamics that were involved as far as, I made mom the promise that I would never put her in a facility, and here we are looking at a facility for her. They didn't understand Medicare. They thought Medicare pays for the whole stay all of the time, every day until death. And other family dynamics were, our family didn't get along before this crisis, and now this crisis just made the family relationships even that much more strained because every family member has their own idea of what quality of life is, how the money should be spent, what kind of care is needed. and all those kind of things. So when we talked about what topic we should present on today, this was definitely like in the forefront, because this is actually the reason I started my business, because families just are not talking about the what ifs of aging. And how to, they have no idea. Most families have no idea what to look for and what to ask about. So that's why I started Care Right, is to help educate families and provide checklists for how to tour with confidence, how to be a bold advocate, all of those types of services for my clients. So it's a daunting, because I've had to also do it personally with my mother. It is a daunting experience having to have your loved one move into a care community when it's become apparent that there's no other option, or there's not a viable option, and care community living is the next step that's needed. So when to seek a move into a care community, it's important to start the research now. Like I just said, the whole reason I started my business is because families were in crisis every single day. And I worked as a social worker in long-term care for 18 years. And every day, my day was exactly the same. It was just a different family. But it was just families in and out of the facility needing tours and not having any idea what to look for, what to ask about. But they were in a crisis and they had no idea, what their parents even had in place, like long-term care insurance, end of life wishes like resuscitate or do not resuscitate. They didn't know if they were even the power of attorney or who was the power of attorney. Like I said, they didn't know if their parent had long-term care insurance. Families just kept responding, I don't know, our family doesn't talk about that. So it's so important to start the research now. And we help our clients with this, but in case you're wanting to do all of this on your own, start the research now, because there's, like I say every day, the people that had major strokes last Thursday didn't wake up thinking, oh, I think I'm going to have a major stroke today, and then have our whole family's lives be completely impacted, and your life completely impacted by having a major stroke, and then having to do all of this information or all of this research at the drop of a hat is nearly impossible and is really overwhelming. So start the research now. What are the care options? What do we qualify for? What a lot of families don't realize is you have to financially, physically, and cognitively qualify to move into different care communities. And what happens is, because most families wait until there's an emergency, you end up with whatever facility or whichever facility has an open bed. And that doesn't mean that that's the right fit, right? So most families choose, or most families wait until there's an emergency, and then they're like, oh, what do we do now? And it's not a comfortable feeling. Of 30 years of working with families in this line of work, I've never had a family member ever come back to me and say, Anna Lee, I feel really confident about the decisions that I had to make on my mother's behalf in the midst of a crisis. I've never had a family member ever come back to me and say, I'm so glad we waited until crisis time to make these big decisions. Your loved one has to qualify to move into specific care communities at certain levels of care. And unfortunately, what happens is, because people don't know that, they're like, well, we always decided that if mom needed to move into a facility, into an assisted living, there's one down the block from me, so she's just going to go there. Well, that's very naive thinking. And the reason is, what if she doesn't have enough money to get into that facility? What if she doesn't have the 8 or 10 years of private pay that's required for her to move in there? Or what if she waited at home so long because she wanted to age in place at home? So what if she waited at home so long that now she doesn't even qualify for assisted living level of care? So she might not meet the financial requirements. She might not meet the physical requirements. Or what if she's got dementia? And again, she waited or the family had her at home kind of too long, and now she doesn't qualify for regular assisted living. She only qualifies for memory care. And what if there's not an opening in the memory care unit? So there's a lot that families need to be considering ahead of time, instead of waiting until they're in crisis, because you don't expect to have the best quality of options when you choose to wait until you're in crisis mode. It just makes things harder. So families often wait until a crisis occurs before they start seeking any kind of this information that they need to have now so that they can make informed decisions. Families don't realize the cost of care because, again, most families think or assume that Medicare is going to pay for everything, and it simply does not. Medicare only pays for certain types of care for certain short periods of time. It's an insurance, so it's not meant to be a long-term solution. You have to continually qualify and continually show progress for Medicare to continue to pay for therapy services and so forth. When we're talking about Medicaid, which is a totally different program, Medicaid is for those that do not have funds and they qualify for the state or the government to pay for their care. Not all facilities contract with Medicaid or state assistance. So it's really important to know where are your parents financially, because when that medical crisis happens, and I say if and when that medical crisis happens, because most of my clients come to me in crisis, and it's just a matter of time when a fall is going to be really detrimental and may not allow them to return home, or they have a stroke, or their dementia progresses and you're not able to keep them at home anymore. It can be very difficult trying to find a care community that has an open apartment or an open bed with bed availability, especially in memory care. There is a national shortage of memory care availability. So when you have a loved one with memory impairment or dementia, you definitely need to be thinking about this now. One of the reasons is because dementia is a long disease and it's a very expensive disease. Not only are the medications that can help with the symptoms like the aggression, agitation, paranoia, anxiety, and depression, not only are those medications pricey and insurance doesn't always pay 100%, but because dementia is an up to 25-year disease, the cost of care is really expensive. So just from a financial perspective, you need to know where your parents are at financially so that you can do proper planning instead of looking at care communities that are private pay only. Eventually, when your loved one runs out of money, they will have to move out to a care community that contracts with Medicaid. The problem with Medicaid, one of the many problems with Medicaid, is that when you go on Medicaid, you lose any choice that you had of care providers, where you go to get care. You go wherever there's an open bed. And so you don't get to choose. You have no choice once you go on Medicaid. So you want to be really careful about how we're being good stewards of your parents' finances. And obviously there's a national shortage of Medicaid facilities as well. And one of the reasons why for that is because in a facility, Medicaid does not pay for the actual true cost of care. So like in a nursing home, for example, that contracts with Medicaid, they get a flat fee from the government. But that doesn't mean that fee, that daily rate that Medicaid pays the nursing home, that doesn't mean that actually covers the cost of care. So for example, if your mother is, morbidly obese and all of her equipment, her hospital bed has to be a bariatric, her wheelchair has to be bariatric, she's diabetic and she's on a lot of medications, and because she doesn't move around very much, she's at a high risk of skin sores and bed sores. Medicaid only pays a flat rate, no matter if it requires 2 people to transfer your mom into a chair and into a bed or not. And so a lot of facilities are not contracting or renewing their contracts with Medicaid because they're losing money. So just so that you know, from like a financial perspective, that's one of the challenges that we have in long-term care is the Medicaid reimbursement rate is much, much lower than what it actually costs to take care of a Medicaid person sometimes. So you have to hire a caregiver while searching for a care community potentially. So say your mom is at home or your parents are at home and you're like, oh, they're not doing as well as we thought. And while you're doing all of this research of care communities and all the different considerations that you need to be thinking about when your parents are going to be leaving their home and moving into a care community. You may need to, have some backup help at home while you go to do the tours, while you fill out paperwork and all those kind of things. So home care is a huge, huge solution to that interim care from keeping, while you're still trying to keep them at home as long as possible, while you make some decisions about the care communities. Move their loved one into a care facility that has an open bed, regardless of fit, reputation, cost. So again, like I said, we already talked about the Medicaid problems, but when you don't put a plan in place, when you don't have an aging plan, again, when that crisis happens, your loved one just goes into whichever facility has an open bed, and that's what you have to do, or that's what needs to be done. And so it's important to put these plans in place ahead of time as much as you can. One of the other things that I think is important to mention too is that when you've got a couple, they don't usually want to be separated. Like my parents were married 63 years. The thought of having them be separated was just heartbreaking. And so when you have aging parents or aging couples, they usually don't want to be separated. And what do you do if mom requires memory care, but dad is perfectly safe and okay at home? But what if the time comes when dad isn't safe at home, and this way they could at least be in the same care community, like a continuing care retirement community, with dad in independent living and mom potentially in memory care. So there's a lot of different nuances to long-term care that a lot of families wouldn't know because you're in uncharted territory. So that's why professionals help you. That's why we help families with these types of issues. So what you can do to prepare now: get educated about aging and your loved one's conditions. So say your loved one has dementia. So I would be researching and learning every single thing I can about dementia and how it's going to affect my loved one, how it's going to affect their finances, what kind of care are they ultimately going to need, and how is it going to affect our family. I always find it curious and interesting that when parents have a child with special needs, they research it all day long, all night long. They know exactly what's going to happen. They know everything that they need to know about that disease that their child has. But yet we don't do the same. We don't have the same courtesy when we have aging parents that have congestive heart failure or COPD or dementia or renal failure. So I'm suggesting that if your loved one has medical conditions, you understand what those conditions are inside and out, and how it's going to affect them and how it's going to affect you. Research your options for care communities, and this is obviously something that we help families with. What's the staff turnover? And I can tell you right now, since the pandemic, most of these facilities have massive turnover, not only in leadership, but also in like floor staff. So like nurses and care providers and care workers. So research what the options are. Where does it make sense for mom to potentially hang her hat? Say mom and dad live in Tucson, Arizona, but you all live in Ohio and Michigan and Milwaukee and, Utah. Well, where does it make sense for mom and dad to live, knowing that as they age, their conditions are going to continually decline, and who's going to be able to hop on a plane to come to the rescue every time there's a hospitalization, or dad falls, or mom's back in the hospital with another urinary tract infection, or dad's dementia progresses to the point where he's not safely taking his medications, he's not eating, so he's lost weight, or he's getting lost when he drives, and you're starting to get worried. So where does it make sense for mom and dad to potentially relocate to based on what they can afford and what care options are available in the locations that you might want to explore? Like I said, we help families with, we actually do this for families. We do all of the market research so that everything that you need as a family is at your fingertips, and we walk you through different considerations and help you with that entire process. work with your financial advisor to plan for costs. Now, some advisors are kind of general practitioners, so they might not really understand the whole intricacies of elders and the cost of care. But especially if you have loved ones that are going to need to go into long-term care communities, those costs are very high. I've got clients paying up to $25,000 a month because both mom and dad are in a nursing home. So, and because a lot of these care communities are so short-staffed, my clients are also having to pay additional private duty companions to come in and help make sure that they get bathed, toileted, and fed. So just work with a financial advisor who truly understands elder planning and has elder planning on their radar, and incorporating elder planning into the financial plan. And I strongly encourage you to get on waiting lists of care communities that you've toured multiple times and that you feel comfortable enough that if mom and dad would ever need to leave their home, that at least they're on the waiting list of 2 or 3 different care communities just in case. Otherwise, I promise you they will end up in whatever facility has an open bed. And that's not always the best fit. Continuums of care communities. So these are Ccrcs, continuing care retirement communities. They have all the different levels. If it's a full continuum or life plan, they have all of the different levels of care, from independent living all the way down to assisted living, memory care, and skilled nursing and skilled rehab. So about the Ccrcs, they have hefty entrance fees. So that might be hundreds of thousands of dollars. I'm here in Florida. There's some that they charge, you have to have 6 million just to even get considered to be able to move in, because again, you have to financially qualify. You have to apply to get into these places. And if you don't meet all of their criteria, you won't be able to get in. So you definitely do not want to be doing this at the 11th hour. Because all of this takes time. The application process takes time. So they might have a $1 million entrance fee, and then you still have your monthly room and board, and you might have a menu plan, and if you have other ancillary charges on top of that. So it's important to know what these costs are so that you can plan accordingly and know which care communities might be the right fits and which ones you'd be wasting your time with. So for example, these are full continuums, right? They have the independent living all the way down, but some of these communities, they're a partial care community or continuum. So they might only have independent living and assisted living, or they might only have assisted living and memory care. Well, what do you do then when mom or dad need a nursing home? They may have to move out. Again, most of these care communities and all of the Ccrcs, all of the full continuums of care, you have to fill out a financial application. So you have to know what your parents have coming in and coming out. So their cash flow, you need to know if they have a trust, so there's a 1 to 2 page form that these facilities have you fill out to make sure that you financially qualify. And then the pre-admission assessments, they're required to do a pre-admission assessment. So it's not like they're just trying to be mean, but they're required to do that because they certainly don't want someone moving in on their campus that's not the right fit. So if you're, they're not going to allow someone to move in if they don't have the financial criteria, and if they've already progressed to the point where they don't fit on that campus anymore. Meaning if it's an assisted living only, and your parent now requires nursing home level of care, they're not going to pass that pre-admission assessment. So again, parents have to financially, physically, and cognitively qualify. And what happens is moms and dads stay at home so long that they've either gone through all of their money on home care, trying to age in place at home, or they've burned out their adult kids because they didn't want to necessarily pay for home care. Or they've just progressed to the point where it's now apparent that they can't stay at home for whatever reason, and now they need to move into a care community. So all of this has to be done strategically, and unfortunately, families do this all on their own, and they don't know what they don't know, and they make really expensive mistakes. So that's why I do a lot of these webinars, and that's why I do what I do to help families avoid those mistakes. there's different levels of care. One thing that, parents in their 70s, 80s, and 90s and 100s, they, in their mind, if they can't stay at home, then the next step is a nursing home, because in their generation, assisted livings are only like 25 years old, 20 to 25 years old. So they didn't have these different options back then. And so a lot of times moms and dads are like, well, if I can't stay at home, then I have to go to a nursing home. And I'm like, no, there's independent living now, there's assisted living, there's all of these kind of in-between places. It's not like it was in the old days where you go home. If you can't make it at home, then you go straight into a nursing home. It's not like that anymore, unless you don't qualify for these other levels of care. But there's independent living. Now, independent living is just like a college dorm. You have to furnish it with your own stuff. There's usually a kitchenette in there, which is great because you have to make your own meals in most of these places. And you also have to be able to manage your own medications, get yourself to the bathroom, get yourself, it's independent. So it's independent living. If you're not able to do those things, then you would have to hire home care to come in and help you with all of those things, those activities of daily living. So independent living is just, in most states, it's just an apartment. One meal a day may be provided. Others don't provide any meals at all because it's just an apartment. So that's the cheapest level of care, if you will, because there's no bells and whistles. There's no glam to it. It's just an apartment. Assisted living is going to be, a couple $3,000, potentially more per month, depending on where you live. But it's a higher level of care than independent living, because assisted living is where you get activities. They have transportation to help you get to doctor's appointments and outings in the community. They have nurses or medication techs, med techs, to administer medications. They have staff there to help with bathing, dressing, and grooming, and helping you get to the dining room. So it's assisted living, right? So what you need help with is what they can do. They have call lights, they have 3 meals a day that they offer. So that's why it's going to cost more, because you're getting more service. Memory care assisted living, that's where they've got, usually it's a secured memory care. It's got a locked door. That's for people that have dementia, that are wanderers and likely to elope or get out of the care community. So if they were eloping at home and wandering around at home and an exit seeker, that's the purpose of a memory care assisted living. Now, if you have a loved one with dementia, they're usually pretty healthy. They get around really well. It's just that their memory is fading. It's a brain disease. So their brain continually is shrinking as that disease progresses. And that's why you see changes in their mood, behavior, personality, their decision making, how they function. You'll see that they fall more because, again, your brain is the control center for your whole body. So it affects everything about what you do and how you think. And eventually someone with dementia or Alzheimer's will need 24/7 care, because that's the nature of that disease. And families just simply aren't usually equipped to manage that disease for the up to 25 years that it can last. So that's the purpose of memory care assisted living. They have nurses or med techs to administer medications, got activities. You'll see when you tour memory care communities that they're in kind of pods or wings. So they're in a smaller environment, because again, we don't want too much stimulation. So you might have 8 or 10 or 12 residents per pod, and then they have their own little dining room and stuff like that. So that's memory care assisted living. Skilled rehab, that's where you go after you've had your 3 qualifying stays in the hospital. So say mom falls and she breaks her hip, and she's got to have hip surgery. She has her 3 overnights. You have to have 3 overnight stays, 3 consecutive overnight stays in the hospital, for you to then, doctors say, yep, Martha needs to go into the rehab unit because she needs daily therapy. That's when Medicare Part A will pay 100% of that rehab stay up to days 20. And then your copay her copay would pay days 21 through 100. But Medicare does not pay 100% all of the time. So sometimes families are like, oh, well, Medicare will pay up to 100 days. Well, it might, but that's for people who are really in a bad way. Those people might have feeding tubes, they've got trachs, you know, they need a high level of care, and that's when Medicare will pay up to 100 days as long as they qualify. But for like a broken hip or falls or pelvic fractures, that's just going to be a few weeks of rehab. So then you still have to make big decisions, because Medicare requires that you get 48 hours notice to figure out what you're going to do as far as the next step, like where's mom or dad going to move when they graduate from rehab. Then you've got skilled nursing or long-term care, what we used to call nursing homes. I've been in the industry for 30 years. So back then we used to just call it nursing homes. But that's skilled nursing. That's 24/7 care, activities are there. Dietitians are there. The doctors come in and check on your loved one. They contract with physician clinics to come in, and that way your loved one doesn't really have to go out unless they have a specialty physician that they have to see, like a urologist or a cardiologist. So we talked about already the independent living, what's all included in those different levels of care. A lot of independent livings, as long as you can answer the questions that they ask you on the pre-admission, then you get in. It's not an admission evaluation as much as it is like in the rest of the levels of care. But again, you must hire private duty home care or a companion if you need help. Some of that's out of pocket, some of it's covered by Medicare. Assisted living, we already covered this, but I want to just go over this. What I didn't talk about was in assisted living, you can still get therapy, and that's under Medicare Part B, because that's not in a hospital setting or in a skilled rehab. So in assisted living, when you get PT, OT, or speech therapy, so physical therapy, occupational therapy, or speech therapy, and other skilled nursing services, or like wound care, for example, that Medicare Part B pays for that in assisted living. Memory care, we talked about this a little bit. The staff are to be specially trained in memory care. So there's different ways that you approach someone with dementia when they're sundowning and they're having a tough time, like later in the afternoon, and they start getting more anxious or more depressed or paranoid or restless. The staff are supposed to be specifically trained in how to manage those different types of behaviors. I want to mention in here too that not only in the memory care level of care, but really all of the different levels of care, I strongly encourage that you get consent or authorization to get a camera installed. Now, some facilities, and we have a list, we research that for the families. Some facilities are adamant that they don't allow cameras at all, and that could be a deal breaker as far as your decision on, as far as if you want your loved one to move into that type of care community. There's no reason to trust the care workers yet, because they haven't taken care of your loved one yet. So they haven't earned that trust. But the only time you wouldn't be able to get a camera is if your loved one was in a room with a roommate, like in a 2-bedroom semi-private nursing home. Skilled rehab, we talked about this already too. One thing that I wanted to mention is, as far as you have to have a qualifying hospital stay, this is a big deal, because you have to be, or your loved one would have to be, admission status and not observation status. And why that's a big deal is because that's thousands of dollars. So if you find yourself in the hospital or your loved one is in the hospital, you need to find out, are they actually admitted, or are they on observation status? Because if your loved one is on observation status and then the doctor says you need to go into a rehab unit, you have to pay for that rehab stay out of pocket, because insurance won't cover that if you or your loved one are on observation status. So that is a really, really big deal. Insurance determines how long you will be able to stay. So every week in a skilled rehab center, every week they have a Medicare meeting or a progress meeting for all of those residents that are getting therapy or are on Medicare. And so Medicare or insurance looks at your progress or your loved one's progress every week. And if they don't think that your loved one or you have made enough progress, then they'll say, look, we're not going to keep paying because they're not motivated to work, or they can't remember one session to the next, or they're not, they keep refusing every time the therapist comes in to do like, okay, Martha, it's time for your rehab. If you continually refuse, your insurance is not going to keep paying. So we need to keep motivated and work really hard with therapy, even though it's sometimes uncomfortable or painful, or we don't feel up to it. But if you lose your mobility, then that causes a whole nother trickle down effect of where are you going to get care if you can't go back home because you didn't do your therapy. So after skilled rehab, there are several options. You can transition into a nursing home if you didn't graduate or you're not strong enough to be able to go back home, or for whatever reason, going back home is no longer an option. Usually it's financially related, because if someone goes back home and they need more home care, like the therapist will say, well, yeah, John can go back home, but he needs 24/7 care. Then do you go back home and try and hope that you can find home care that's going to be consistent, reliable, and compassionate for 24/7 care? What's the plan if the caregiver doesn't show up for their shift? Or like right now, because we have such a massive shortage of care workers, what if the home care companies can't provide a caregiver for 2 or 3 weeks, or they can only cover partial shifts? Who's going to take care of you, or who's going to take care of mom or dad? So sometimes people end up just saying, okay, going back home is not an option. So we need to go into long-term care. And then at some point, potentially just qualify or apply for Medicaid when your funds run low. Long-term care until death, that's usually, when you go into long-term care, the nursing home, that's for people who have such major care needs that they simply can't go back home, or they can't afford to go back home with home care. Long-term care insurance, when we talked in the beginning about knowing where your parents are financially, or if you're the mom and the dad on this webinar, how much have you communicated? Do you have long-term care insurance, or do your parents have long-term care insurance? Because if they do, you really want to get familiar with that policy, because it could definitely pay for some of the care that you or your parents might need. You want to look at how much, what's the elimination period? So do they have to pay out of pocket for the first 100 days and then the insurance will kick in, and how much will it cover? So if there is long-term care insurance, really explore what that is, because I've got clients that didn't realize that they had long-term care insurance because they never talked about it. And here the kids had been paying for mom and dad's care out of their own pockets for months until they hired me. And I'm like, well, is there long-term care insurance? And they're like, oh, we never even thought about that. And here the kids have been pitching in $3,000 altogether, $3,000 a month to pay for home care, because they had made the promise to mom that they would never put her in a nursing home. So look to see what, have these conversations with mom and dad about what do you have in place, because you're going to need to know at some point. In skilled nursing or long-term care, they have what's called care conferences. This is, for the most part, they're quarterly care conferences with a nurse or a social worker, the dietitian or the activity director. So it's kind of like when you're in school and you have the parent-teacher conferences. How is mom doing? Is she eating? Is she losing weight? Is she falling? They review the medications. They ask you if there's any concerns or any questions. They should be going over like the do not resuscitate or the CPR, the full code, just to make sure nothing's changed on that. So it's just kind of a touch base meeting. It's short. It's about 15 minutes. So it's just kind of a down and dirty on how is mom or how is dad doing. And they have what's called a care plan. So that's their list of goals. Mom won't fall for these next 3 months, and how they're going to prevent her from falling, whether it's a low bed or she needs to be out in a supervised setting so that they can keep an eye on her. So every resident in a facility like this has what's called a care plan. Same is true with home care too. They have what's called a care plan. So as you can imagine, the care in many of these care communities has definitely suffered and plummeted since the pandemic. We've got the biggest shortage of workers probably in the history of healthcare. I wrote my thesis about this in 2008 with healthcare workers already having a shortage because families are smaller than they used to be. Like when I first started as a social worker 30 years ago, my residents in long-term care, they were one of 8 or 10 or 12 siblings, right? Families are just smaller and smaller and smaller. And so that automatically reduces the care, healthcare worker field, and that obviously also reduces the family caregivers. And family caregivers take the most care of most seniors. So the care of these communities has been an issue, especially since the pandemic. So we teach our clients how to be bold advocates, and that's why we also teach our clients how to tour these care communities and how to be an advocate for you or for your loved one. When you find yourself in a facility or in a situation that they are not providing the quality of care or showing the attentiveness that your loved one should have, this is the process that you use. So you notify the department head immediately of any concerns. So if you just talk to the CNA or the care worker, they're going to be like, yeah, okay, whatever. It's a lot of them just that's kind of their response. They're just there to toilet your loved one and get you showered and stuff like that. So when you have complaints, you need to go to someone in charge. So you need to find the charge nurse or the director of nurses, because they are the ones responsible for the staff. So notify the department head immediately of concerns. So if your concerns are care related, you would go to the nurse, the charge nurse or the director of nurses. If your complaints are mom doesn't like broccoli and they keep serving her broccoli, then you would obviously go to the dietary manager. So whatever department that it is, if you feel like your loved one's not getting invited to activities, you would go to the activity director. So if you feel like your loved one's not getting the therapy or showing enough progress in therapy, you would go to the therapy department, therapy director. So go to the correct department head. Keep good notes and documentation. Anytime you have concerns, or anytime you see or hear something that's concerning, you need to document it, just like a nurse would. Document the date, the time, who was around. Was there a care worker around? Was there another family member around? Take pictures. You have to keep good records, but you need to report concerns to these staff right away. Don't wait for the care conference, for example, to say, well, yeah, 2.5 months ago, mom's room was really dirty and the staff weren't very attentive. You need to document it, but you need to report your concerns right away, like that same day, to the person in charge. If the facility internally is not addressing your concerns to your satisfaction, the hierarchy in a care facility is you notify the department head, so like the director of nurses, but these facilities also have executive directors or administrators. So work your way up internally. If they still are not addressing the issues, every state has what's called an Ombudsman program, and these are people that are advocates for residents within a care facility as well. So every state has an ombudsman and multiple ombudsmans too, depending on how large the state is. So you can go through the ombudsman and report your concerns, and then they can help you address those concerns with the facility. And then you can also go into you can actually file a complaint with the state. So if the care is if they still are just not managing to take proper care of you or your parent or your loved one, then you file an actual complaint with the state. I've had to do that before for residents or my clients, that their families put them in facilities because they didn't know what to look for and stuff. And so they kind of just had mom and dad go into whatever facility had an open bed because they were in crisis mode. And then found that the care in that facility was horrible. And because they were on Medicaid, they couldn't get into any other facility nearby. And so the family chose to keep mom and dad where they are and then just be bold advocates. But we've had to file complaints with the state before where I've submitted, 10, 15 pages of reports and stuff on the family's behalf. So there are ways around it. One facility that I filed a 35-page complaint, the state, when they did come out to do their state survey, their complaint survey, they found the complaints valid, or what's called substantiated. And that facility fired 15 of their care workers in the memory care facility. So it does pay, it absolutely does pay to be that bold advocate on behalf of either your loved one or other residents in these facilities. And the state, that's their job, is to make sure that these facilities are providing quality care. So those are just, I know it's a lot, I always throw out a lot of information, and it's helpful, I think, to kind of go over it a couple times, just because it's confusing for people if this is kind of new for you, like what are the differences in levels of care, but different tips and advice, like the camera and how to be a bold advocate. And at least if you're finding yourself or your loved one is in a care community that's not providing the best quality of care, at least now you've got kind of a step-by-step process of how to try to make that better. We also do mediation within these facilities, so we can act as your advocate as well. It shouldn't be this way, but sometimes facilities listen better when they're working with a professional instead of just the family members. So that's what I have for today. Are there any questions?
Yes, and I'm going to go ahead and take over the screen here, Annalee, so you don't have to worry about running the slideshow anymore.
You always make my life easier, Marche.
Absolutely. In fact, let me go ahead and put it on the right slide here. All right, so here are we do have a few questions. So you talked about having to qualify financially, physically, and cognitively for certain care communities. As far as financially, that makes sense. Can you pay for it? Physically, can you give some examples? And cognitively, like what kind of examples are there?
Yep. So physically, and this is why when we have our aging parents at home, we want to really motivate them and try to encourage them to be active, right? Because a lot of times what happens is they're sitting in their recliner and they're watching TV, and their stimulation, their socialization is the TV, especially coming out of this long pandemic, and people are still concerned about getting out and about, right? So they're just still hunkered down. So when we talk about physical, you have to pass their physical assessment. If mom or dad are just sitting in front of sitting in their recliner watching TV all day, they're probably not eating very well, because they're going to be losing mobility. If you don't use it, you lose it. That has been that's been a forever long saying, and it's true. So if they're not moving around, they're not getting exercise, and they're not getting proper socialization, they're going to decline. And so and when they start losing weight because they're not eating well, because they don't have the energy or the stamina to continually get out of their chair, then you might start seeing incontinence. If they're diabetic and they're not compliant, or they're not managing their diabetes, that can be something that could be an issue when they're trying to move in to like an assisted living. If it's unmanaged diabetes, that could be a trigger. If they're obese, that could be a trigger that could make it difficult to have them qualify to get into a place. Physically, if they're just not active and moving, they may not qualify for assisted living. If they can only what we call pivot transfer, like get in and out of their chair by just standing up and bearing weight long enough to like turn their bottom to sit down in that next chair, they may not qualify for assisted living. So it's really important that moms and dads keep as busy and active as they can. Cognitively, that is if mom has dementia and it's progressed to the point where she's just simply not safe at home, she's leaving the oven on, she's trying to wander out of the house, or many states have what's called a silver alert when someone's got dementia and they're driving and they get lost. And families like, oh my gosh, mom was supposed to be home, this morning, and now it's 8 o'clock at night. Where is she? So cognitively, if if they don't pass the memory exam and the cognition tests that a lot of these care communities administer, then they may end up finding themselves in a locked memory care unit or in a nursing home. So you have to be able to meet these facilities criteria. So I did want to kind of go back to the Ccrcs, the care continuum communities. So there are some that don't have, that bodacious move-in entrance fee. There's some that have, that, and that's why we get the financial picture of what our client has, so that we're not presenting options that aren't options, right? So there are some that actually have like a $3,000 entrance fee, and then it's, $3,000 to $5,000 a month, depending on their level of care. So when we talk about level of care in assisted living, if your mom and dad can, feed themselves and shower and get themselves to the bathroom, they're going to have a much lower monthly level of care cost. So the more care that your loved one needs in assisted living, then they're going to ratchet up to that next highest level of care cost. But it's still cheaper than a nursing home, right?
All right, here's the next question. So why do you think people don't plan beforehand? Like you said about families who maybe have disabilities in their families, they're planning a lot. What do you see the barrier to planning?
Denial. Mom's doing just fine at home. Well, it probably does sound like she's doing just fine if you talk to her every 3 weeks for 10 or 15 minutes. And moms and dads have pride. They don't want to say, well, I haven't eaten since yesterday, or I didn't know I was supposed to renew my prescription, and I haven't been taking my pills for the last 3 months. So a lot of it is denial. We think that our parents are doing better than they really are. And so when kids do travel to go see their loved one, they're often blindsided because they're like, oh my gosh, dad's lost weight, or mom's way more confused than she ever has been before. Or, we looked at their medications and they haven't been taking their medications, for weeks, or their medications are all messed up. Or we went there to stay for a long weekend and they fell 3 times and the house wasn't tidy like it normally is, or the kids got there and they saw like months of mail just piled up because now their parents are just too progressed to be able to manage their own mail. So some of it's denial, some of it is, the parents hide, they cover how poorly they're really doing. And it's been a challenge with, when families started moving away from each other, we don't have an opportunity to check in on our parents as often as if we were just down the street like it was 30 years ago and everybody lived, in the same zip code. But as families started moving away, if they don't take time to, or have the time to continually check on their parents, then that's when they get blindsided. So denial, parents covering, and then just family relationships. Maybe mom and dad weren't the best parents that they could have been, and so you only talk to them or check in on them once every year or so, and then you're like, oh my gosh, they're really not doing well. So that's a lot of it. And another reason I think is it's hard to have a family meeting or facilitate a family meeting when you don't really know what to talk about. Families don't usually have like this whole agenda like what we do with our clients when we facilitate their family meetings, like what's working well, what's not working well, what do you already have in place, who's the power of attorney, who handles your finances, what are your accounts and your passwords, like what kind of conversations have you already had. One way that families can broach these topics is leverage a crisis. So say dad just got out of the hospital and you're like, oh my gosh, you guys, we're really ill-equipped. Like we didn't know if he had long-term care insurance. We didn't, a lot of these kids find out that they're the power of attorney when mom is in the hospital. And the doctor's like, so what are you going to do? What's your decision for your mom? And they're like, what are you talking about? Well, you're the healthcare power of attorney. Oh my gosh, I didn't know that. We've never talked about it. So leverage a medical crisis, or leverage a fall, or leverage a doctor's appointment where the doctor's like, Ethel, you've lost 20 pounds since you were here before. Obviously, when there's a weight loss and there's falls and there's, not enough engagement and activity at home, no one should be surprised that their parent's not doing very well. So denial, parents covering, no one really wants to talk about aging. And that's again why I started my business, because families aren't talking about these things.
And then one final question before we end, I'm going to hurry and get this one in. Can you talk a little bit about someone who's maybe not an aging person yet? Maybe they're still, working full-time, raising their family. What sort of steps can you have in place for yourself?
Oh, that is a really good question. So what's really important for, so I'm 50, right? So what's important at our age group, in our age group, and really actually any age group, is that you have your affairs in order. Make sure that you've got your living will. Make sure you have your power of attorney. What do you have for life insurance? What do you have for, do you have a funeral arrangements taken care of? Do you have your accounts, your passwords? Do you have, we talk about this on almost every one of these webinars. Do you have your grab and go binder, so that if something should happen to you, what do you have in place? And you need to communicate these things to your family, so that if you get in a car accident, or if you're 50 years old and you have that heart attack or that stroke, because no one plans for that stuff, you have to have your stuff in order, or your family's going to be left scrambling. So hopefully that answers the question. At least get your affairs in order, and be thinking, having these conversations with your kids now, so that if or when the time comes that more major health issues happen, you've already conditioned your family that, hey, we're a family that talks, we're a family that communicates, instead of waiting until there's crisis time, when emotions are high and time is limited, to make big decisions. That is the worst time to do all of this, but that's what most families wait to do.
Well, thank you so much for that. I appreciate that. Good advice to go out on. I want to thank the attendees that have been here today, and I want to remind you that we will be sending out a link to a replay of this event, and so you're welcome to share that with friends and family. Here at Advice Chaser, we're all about helping you find a financial advisor who's a great fit for your life and your financial questions. Our matching service is free to you, and every one of our advisor partners has committed to offer a free initial consultation to anyone we introduce them to. Find out more by going to advicechaser.com and clicking on the link to find an advisor. Once again, from Advice Chaser, thank you so much for coming, and we'll see you at another webinar soon. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye.